Section 13 of 1000 Things Worth Knowing. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Betty B. 1000 Things Worth Knowing by Nathaniel C. Fowler, Jr. Distances between cities in the United States. Not airline distances, but traveling distances. From Atlanta to New York, 876 miles. Atlanta to Chicago, 733 miles. Atlanta to Philadelphia, 785 miles. Atlanta to St. Louis, 611 miles. Baltimore to New York, 188 miles. Baltimore to Chicago, 802 miles. Baltimore to Philadelphia, 97 miles. Baltimore to St. Louis, 934 miles. Boston to New York, 217 miles. Boston to Chicago, 1,034 miles. Boston to Philadelphia, 321 miles. Boston to St. Louis, 1,230 miles. Buffalo to New York, 442 miles. Buffalo to Chicago, 525 miles. Buffalo to Philadelphia, 416 miles. Buffalo to St. Louis, 731 miles. Chicago to New York, 912 miles. Chicago to Philadelphia, 821 miles. Chicago to St. Louis, 284 miles. Cincinnati to New York, 757 miles. Cincinnati to Chicago, 298 miles. Cincinnati to Philadelphia, 666 miles. Cincinnati to St. Louis, 341 miles. Cleveland to New York, 584 miles. Cleveland to Chicago, 357 miles. Cleveland to Philadelphia, 493 miles. Cleveland to St. Louis, 548 miles. Denver to New York, 1,934 miles. Denver to Chicago, 1,022 miles. Denver to Philadelphia, 1,843 miles. Denver to St. Louis, 916 miles. Detroit to New York, 693 miles. Detroit to Chicago, 272 miles. Detroit to Philadelphia, 669 miles. Detroit to St. Louis, 488 miles. Galveston to New York, 1,792 miles. Galveston to Chicago, 1,144 miles. Galveston to Philadelphia, 1,691 miles. Galveston to St. Louis, 860 miles. Indianapolis to New York, 825 miles. Indianapolis to Chicago, 183 miles. Indianapolis to Philadelphia, 734 miles. Indianapolis to St. Louis, 240 miles. Jacksonville, Florida to New York, 983 miles. Jacksonville to Chicago, 1,097 miles. Jacksonville to Philadelphia, 892 miles. Jacksonville to St. Louis, 975 miles. Kansas City to New York, 1,342 miles. Kansas City to Chicago, 458 miles. Kansas City to Philadelphia, 1,251 miles. Kansas City to St. Louis, 277 miles. Los Angeles to New York, 3,149 miles. Los Angeles to Chicago, 2,265 miles. Los Angeles to Philadelphia, 3,058 miles. Los Angeles to St. Louis, 2,084 miles. Louisville to New York, 871 miles. Louisville to Chicago, 304 miles. Louisville to Philadelphia, 780 miles. Louisville to St. Louis, 274 miles. Memphis to New York, 1,157 miles. Memphis to Chicago, 527 miles. Memphis to Philadelphia, 1,066 miles. Memphis to St. Louis, 311 miles. Milwaukee to New York, 997 miles. Milwaukee to Chicago, 85 miles. Milwaukee to Philadelphia, 906 miles. Milwaukee to St. Louis, 369 miles. Minneapolis to New York, 1,332 miles. Minneapolis to Chicago, 420 miles. Minneapolis to Philadelphia, 1,241 miles. Minneapolis to St. Louis, 586 miles. Montreal to New York, 386 miles. Montreal to Chicago, 841 miles. Montreal to Philadelphia, 477 miles. Montreal to St. Louis, 1,051 miles. New Orleans to New York, 1,372 miles. New Orleans to Chicago, 912 miles. New Orleans to Philadelphia, 1,281 miles. New Orleans to St. Louis, 699 miles. New York to Chicago, 912 miles. New York to Philadelphia, 91 miles. New York to St. Louis, 1,065 miles. Omaha to New York, 1,405 miles. Omaha to Chicago, 493 miles. Omaha to Philadelphia, 1,314 miles. Omaha to St. Louis, 413 miles. Philadelphia to New York, 91 miles. Philadelphia to Chicago, 821 miles. Philadelphia to St. Louis, 974 miles. Pittsburgh to New York, 444 miles. Pittsburgh to Chicago, 468 miles. Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, 353 miles. Pittsburgh to St. Louis, 621 miles. Portland, Oregon to New York, 3,204 miles. Portland to Chicago, 2,292 miles. Portland to Philadelphia, 3,113 miles. Portland to St. Louis, 2,212 miles. Quebec to New York, 530 miles. Quebec to Chicago, 1,013 miles. Quebec to Philadelphia, 621 miles. Quebec to St. Louis, 1,343 miles. St. Louis to New York, 1,065 miles. St. Louis to Chicago, 284 miles. St. Louis to Philadelphia, 974 miles. San Francisco to New York, 3,186 miles. San Francisco to Chicago, 2,274 miles. San Francisco to Philadelphia, 3,095 miles. San Francisco to St. Louis, 2,194 miles. Seattle to New York, 3,151 miles. Seattle to Chicago, 2,239 miles. Seattle to Philadelphia, 3,060 miles. Seattle to St. Louis, 2,332 miles. Washington to New York, 228 miles. Washington to Chicago, 790 miles. Washington to Philadelphia, 137 miles. Washington to St. Louis, 894 miles. Atlanta to Boston, 1,106 miles. Atlanta to Baltimore, 688 miles. Atlanta to Cleveland, 736 miles. Atlanta to Buffalo, 919 miles. Baltimore to Boston, 418 miles. Baltimore to Cleveland, 474 miles. Baltimore to Buffalo, 398 miles. Boston to Baltimore, 418 miles. Boston to Cleveland, 682 miles. Boston to Buffalo, 499 miles. Buffalo to Boston, 499 miles. Buffalo to Baltimore, 398 miles. Buffalo to Cleveland, 183 miles. Chicago to Boston, 1,034 miles. Chicago to Baltimore, 802 miles. Chicago to Cleveland, 357 miles. Chicago to Buffalo, 525 miles. Cincinnati to Boston, 926 miles. Cincinnati to Baltimore, 802 miles. Chicago to Cleveland, 357 miles. Chicago to Buffalo, 525 miles. Cincinnati to Boston, 926 miles. Cincinnati to Baltimore, 593 miles. Cincinnati to Cleveland, 244 miles. Cincinnati to Buffalo, 427 miles. Cleveland to Boston, 682 miles. Cleveland to Baltimore, 474 miles. Cleveland to Buffalo, 183 miles. Denver to Boston, 2,056 miles. Denver to Baltimore, 1,850 miles. Denver to Cleveland, 1,379 miles. Denver to Buffalo, 1,537 miles. Detroit to Boston, 750 miles. Detroit to Baltimore, 649 miles. Detroit to Cleveland, 173 miles. Detroit to Buffalo, 251 miles. Galveston to Boston, 2,012 miles. Galveston to Baltimore, 1,594 miles. Galveston to Cleveland, 1,408 miles. Galveston to Buffalo, 1,591 miles. Indianapolis to Boston, 965 miles. Indianapolis to Baltimore, 704 miles. Indianapolis to Cleveland, 283 miles. Indianapolis to Buffalo, 466 miles. Jacksonville, Florida to Boston, 1,213 miles. Jacksonville to Baltimore, 795 miles. Jacksonville to Cleveland, 1,085 miles. Jacksonville to Buffalo, 1,193 miles. Kansas City to Boston, 1,466 miles. Kansas City to Baltimore, 1,211 miles. Kansas City to Cleveland, 755 miles. Kansas City to Buffalo, 967 miles. Los Angeles to Boston, 3,273 miles. Los Angeles to Baltimore, 3,018 miles. Los Angeles to Cleveland, 2,562 miles. Los Angeles to Buffalo, 2,774 miles. Louisville to Boston, 1,040 miles. Louisville to Baltimore, 703 miles. Louisville to Cleveland, 358 miles. Louisville to Buffalo, 541 miles. Memphis to Boston, 1,387 miles. Memphis to Baltimore, 969 miles. Memphis to Cleveland, 738 miles. Memphis to Buffalo, 921 miles. Milwaukee to Boston, 1,119 miles. Milwaukee to Baltimore, 887 miles. Milwaukee to Cleveland, 442 miles. Milwaukee to Buffalo, 610 miles. Minneapolis to Boston, 1,454 miles. Minneapolis to Baltimore, 1,222 miles. Minneapolis to Cleveland, 777 miles. Minneapolis to Buffalo, 945 miles. Montreal to Boston, 330 miles. Montreal to Baltimore, 574 miles. Montreal to Cleveland, 623 miles. Montreal to Buffalo, 434 miles. New Orleans to Boston, 1,602 miles. New Orleans to Baltimore, 1,184 miles. New Orleans to Cleveland, 1,073 miles. New Orleans to Buffalo, 1,256 miles. New York to Boston, 217 miles. New York to Baltimore, 188 miles. New York to Cleveland, 584 miles. New York to Buffalo, 442 miles. Omaha to Boston, 1,527 miles. Omaha to Baltimore, 1,295 miles. Omaha to Cleveland, 1,750 miles. Omaha to Buffalo, 1,018 miles. Philadelphia to Boston, 321 miles. Philadelphia to Baltimore, 97 miles. Philadelphia to Cleveland, 493 miles. Philadelphia to Buffalo, 416 miles. Pittsburgh to Boston, 674 miles. Pittsburgh to Baltimore, 334 miles. Pittsburgh to Cleveland, 135 miles. Pittsburgh to Buffalo, 270 miles. Portland, Oregon to Boston, 3,326 miles. Portland to Baltimore, 3,094 miles. Portland to Cleveland, 2,649 miles. Portland to Buffalo, 2,817 miles. Quebec to Boston, 402 miles. Quebec to Baltimore, 718 miles. Quebec to Cleveland, 795 miles. Quebec to Buffalo, 612 miles. St. Louis to Boston, 1,230 miles. St. Louis to Baltimore, 934 miles. St. Louis to Cleveland, 548 miles. St. Louis to Buffalo, 731 miles. San Francisco to Boston, 3,308 miles. San Francisco to Baltimore, 2,076 miles. San Francisco to Cleveland, 2,631 miles. San Francisco to Buffalo, 2,799 miles. Seattle to Boston, 3,273 miles. Seattle to Baltimore, 2,941 miles. Seattle to Cleveland, 2,596 miles. Seattle to Buffalo, 2,764 miles. Washington to Boston, 458 miles. Washington to Baltimore, 40 miles. Washington to Cleveland, 437 miles. Washington to Buffalo, 438 miles. Atlanta to San Francisco, 2,805 miles. Atlanta to Pittsburgh, 805 miles. Atlanta to Cincinnati, 492 miles. Atlanta to Milwaukee, 818 miles. Baltimore to San Francisco, 3,076 miles. Baltimore to Pittsburgh, 334 miles. Baltimore to Cincinnati, 593 miles. Baltimore to Milwaukee, 887 miles. Boston to San Francisco, 3,308 miles. Boston to Pittsburgh, 674 miles. Boston to Cincinnati, 926 miles. Boston to Milwaukee, 1,119 miles. Buffalo to San Francisco, 2,799 miles. Buffalo to Pittsburgh, 270 miles. Buffalo to Cincinnati, 427 miles. Buffalo to Milwaukee, 610 miles. Chicago to San Francisco, 2,274 miles. Chicago to Pittsburgh, 468 miles. Chicago to Cincinnati, 298 miles. Chicago to Milwaukee, 85 miles. Cincinnati to San Francisco, 2,572 miles. Cincinnati to Pittsburgh, 313 miles. Cincinnati to Milwaukee, 383 miles. Cleveland to San Francisco, 2,631 miles. Cleveland to Pittsburgh, 135 miles. Cleveland to Cincinnati, 244 miles. Cleveland to Milwaukee, 442 miles. Denver to San Francisco, 1,371 miles. Denver to Pittsburgh, 1,490 miles. Denver to Cincinnati, 1,257 miles. Denver to Milwaukee, 1,107 miles. Detroit to San Francisco, 2,546 miles. Detroit to Pittsburgh, 321 miles. Detroit to Cincinnati, 263 miles. Detroit to Milwaukee, 357 miles. Galveston to San Francisco, 2,157 miles. Galveston to Pittsburgh, 1,481 miles. Galveston to Cincinnati, 1,157 miles. Galveston to Milwaukee, 1,229 miles. Indianapolis to San Francisco, 2,457 miles. Indianapolis to Pittsburgh, 381 miles. Indianapolis to Cincinnati, 111 miles. Indianapolis to Milwaukee, 268 miles. Jacksonville, Florida to San Francisco, 3,098 miles. Jacksonville to Pittsburgh, 1,057 miles. Jacksonville to Cincinnati, 841 miles. Jacksonville to Milwaukee, 1,182 miles. Kansas City to San Francisco, 1,981 miles. Kansas City to Pittsburgh, 898 miles. Kansas City to Cincinnati, 618 miles. Kansas City to Milwaukee, 543 miles. Los Angeles to San Francisco, 475 miles. Los Angeles to Pittsburgh, 2,705 miles. Los Angeles to Cincinnati, 2,425 miles. Los Angeles to Milwaukee, 2,350 miles. Louisville to San Francisco, 2,468 miles. Louisville to Pittsburgh, 427 miles. Louisville to Cincinnati, 114 miles. Louisville to Milwaukee, 389 miles. Memphis to San Francisco, 2,439 miles. Memphis to Pittsburgh, 807 miles. Memphis to Cincinnati, 494 miles. Memphis to Milwaukee, 612 miles. Milwaukee to San Francisco, 2,359 miles. Milwaukee to Pittsburgh, 553 miles. Milwaukee to Cincinnati, 383 miles. Minneapolis to San Francisco, 2,096 miles. Minneapolis to Pittsburgh, 888 miles. Minneapolis to Cincinnati, 718 miles. Minneapolis to Milwaukee, 335 miles. Montreal to San Francisco, 3,115 miles. Montreal to Pittsburgh, 704 miles. Montreal to Cincinnati, 826 miles. Montreal to Milwaukee, 926 miles. New Orleans to San Francisco, 2,482 miles. New Orleans to Pittsburgh, 1,142 miles. New Orleans to Cincinnati, 829 miles. New Orleans to Milwaukee, 997 miles. New York to San Francisco, 3,186 miles. New York to Pittsburgh, 444 miles. New York to Cincinnati, 757 miles. New York to Milwaukee, 997 miles. Omaha to San Francisco, 1,781 miles. Omaha to Pittsburgh, 961 miles. Omaha to Cincinnati, 791 miles. Omaha to Milwaukee, 578 miles. Philadelphia to San Francisco, 3,095 miles. Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, 353 miles. Philadelphia to Cincinnati, 666 miles. Philadelphia to Milwaukee, 906 miles. Pittsburgh to San Francisco, 2,742 miles. Pittsburgh to Cincinnati, 313 miles. Pittsburgh to Milwaukee, 553 miles. Portland, Oregon to San Francisco, 772 miles. Portland to Pittsburgh, 2,760 miles. Portland to Cincinnati, 2,590 miles. Portland to Milwaukee, 2,378 miles. Quebec to San Francisco, 3,287 miles. Quebec to Pittsburgh, 876 miles. Quebec to Cincinnati, 1,039 miles. Quebec to Milwaukee, 1,098 miles. St. Louis to San Francisco, 2,194 miles. St. Louis to Pittsburgh, 621 miles. St. Louis to Cincinnati, 341 miles. St. Louis to Milwaukee, 369 miles. San Francisco to Pittsburgh, 2,742 miles. San Francisco to Cincinnati, 2,572 miles. San Francisco to Milwaukee, 2,359 miles. Seattle to San Francisco, 957 miles. Seattle to Pittsburgh, 2,707 miles. Seattle to Cincinnati, 2,537 miles. Seattle to Milwaukee, 2,154 miles. Washington to San Francisco, 3,064 miles. Washington to Pittsburgh, 302 miles. Washington to Cincinnati, 553 miles. Washington to Milwaukee, 875 miles. Atlanta to New Orleans, 496 miles. Atlanta to Washington, 648 miles. Atlanta to Minneapolis, 1,153 miles. Baltimore to New Orleans, 1,184 miles. Baltimore to Washington, 40 miles. Baltimore to Minneapolis, 1,222 miles. Boston to New Orleans, 1,602 miles. Boston to Washington, 458 miles. Boston to Minneapolis, 1,454 miles. Buffalo to New Orleans, 1,256 miles. Buffalo to Washington, 438 miles. Buffalo to Minneapolis, 945 miles. Chicago to New Orleans, 912 miles. Chicago to Washington, 790 miles. Chicago to Minneapolis, 420 miles. Cincinnati to New Orleans, 829 miles. Cincinnati to Washington, 553 miles. Cincinnati to Minneapolis, 718 miles. Cleveland to New Orleans, 1,073 miles. Cleveland to Washington, 437 miles. Cleveland to Minneapolis, 777 miles. Denver to New Orleans, 1,347 miles. Denver to Washington, 1,810 miles. Denver to Minneapolis, 884 miles. Detroit to New Orleans, 1,092 miles. Detroit to Washington, 655 miles. Detroit to Minneapolis, 692 miles. Galveston to New Orleans, 410 miles. Galveston to Washington, 1,554 miles. Galveston to Minneapolis, 1,340 miles. Indianapolis to New Orleans, 888 miles. Indianapolis to Washington, 664 miles. Indianapolis to Minneapolis, 603 miles. Jacksonville, Florida to New Orleans, 616 miles. Jacksonville to Washington, 755 miles. Jacksonville to Minneapolis, 1,517 miles. Kansas City to New Orleans, 880 miles. Kansas City to Washington, 1,171 miles. Kansas City to Minneapolis, 573 miles. Los Angeles to New Orleans, 2,007 miles. Los Angeles to Washington, 2,978 miles. Los Angeles to Minneapolis, 2,301 miles. Louisville to New Orleans, 778 miles. Louisville to Washington, 663 miles. Louisville to Minneapolis, 727 miles. Memphis to New Orleans, 396 miles. Memphis to Washington, 929 miles. Memphis to Minneapolis, 897 miles. Milwaukee to New Orleans, 997 miles. Milwaukee to Washington, 875 miles. Milwaukee to Minneapolis, 335 miles. Minneapolis to New Orleans, 1,285 miles. Minneapolis to Washington, 1,210 miles. Montreal to New Orleans, 1,655 miles. Montreal to Washington, 614 miles. Montreal to Minneapolis, 1,125 miles. New Orleans to Washington, 1,144 miles. New Orleans to Minneapolis, 1,285 miles. New York to New Orleans, 1,372 miles. New York to Washington, 228 miles. New York to Minneapolis, 1,332 miles. Omaha to New Orleans, 1,080 miles. Omaha to Washington, 1,283 miles. Omaha to Minneapolis, 381 miles. Philadelphia to New Orleans, 1,281 miles. Philadelphia to Washington, 137 miles. Philadelphia to Minneapolis, 1,241 miles. Pittsburgh to New Orleans, 1,142 miles. Pittsburgh to Washington, 302 miles. Pittsburgh to Minneapolis, 888 miles. Portland, Oregon to New Orleans, 2,746 miles. Portland to Washington, 3,082 miles. Portland to Minneapolis, 2,042 miles. Quebec to New Orleans, 1,827 miles. Quebec to Washington, 786 miles. Quebec to Minneapolis, 1,433 miles. St. Louis to New Orleans, 699 miles. St. Louis to Washington, 894 miles. St. Louis to Minneapolis, 586 miles. San Francisco to New Orleans, 2,482 miles. San Francisco to Washington, 3,064 miles. San Francisco to Minneapolis, 2,096 miles. Seattle to New Orleans, 2,931 miles. Seattle to Washington, 3,029 miles. Seattle to Minneapolis, 1,818 miles. Washington to New Orleans, 1,144 miles. Washington to Minneapolis, 1,210 miles. End of section 13.